I'm going to take a step back for a moment. I would just like to say that the way that I look at the practice of yoga encompasses every single aspect of one's life. And I'm going to talk to guys here right for a moment. It's really working on becoming the most skillful, badass motherfucker you can be. Period. So if you're interested in being a skillful, badass motherfucker, then you want to get into the practice of yoga. And what I mean by that is really looking the perspective of your life as something that is largely in your hand and being able to take control of it. That means from a mental perspective, an emotional perspective, physical perspective, spiritual perspective. It's the whole kit and caboodle.
Welcome to Guys Talking Yoga, a podcast created to help men get into the practice of yoga by sharing the stories and paths of other guys. I'm your host, Derek Walker, and we've got a great conversation today. We've invited back two of our most popular guests, Johnny Gillespie and Neil Taylor, to explore what is yoga. We hit a number of themes around aspects of the physical practice, alignment and balance, but we also hit on some other concepts such as skillfulness, connection, vulnerability, and wisdom. Not really the kind of things you probably think about when you roll out your yoga mat. Now, if you're not familiar with the previous episodes, Neil's a bodyworker and a meditation and yoga teacher up in the Boston area. And Johnny's down in Wilmington, Delaware. He's the founder and owner of Empower Wellness Studio and the creator of The Balanced Athlete, an online and studio-based functional fitness program that teaches people how to mindfully move within their bodies. Enjoy the conversation.
I would just start by saying I consider Johnny one of my teachers. I was a sub at a yoga studio local to me, and Johnny was coming through town teaching the kind of early inception of what is now Balanced Athlete, I think. Hadn't even gotten that name quite yet. And I just really connected with his teaching. And then he came back and he brought with him this guy named David Nichtern, Johnny's Buddhist teacher. And then I met David and started studying with David. And yeah, I learned a lot from Johnny about body mechanics. And he introduced me to my Buddhist teacher and even gave that studio owner a nudge to put me on the schedule permanently. So in the world of favors, I owe Johnny a couple.
Hey, Johnny, can you give us a little context on who David is and his impact on your life?
Yeah, David's a 75-year-old incredible human being who lives up in Manhattan, David Nichtern. And he met his meditation teacher, I believe he was 20 or 21 in 1969 up in Boston. It was Trungpa Rinpoche, who eventually went on to really spread the seeds of Buddhism in North America. David worked and studied with Trungpa for 18 years until Trungpa passed, I believe in 1987. David's an accomplished musician. I think he's won 3 Emmys, a one-time Grammy nominee. I met David on January 7th, 2005, kind of like the day I met Sarah. It's a day that I'll never forget because my life kind of shifted a lot in a really kind of ordinary and kind of not mystical or mysterious kind of way. Just I met a pretty incredible human being that I wanted to spend time with and learn from. Yeah. And that's David. I could talk about David for hours upon hours and upon hours. And then made the intro to Neil. And it's kind of like you guys have a lot to talk about, Neil and David.
So thank you for that, Johnny. So I feel like these conversations about yoga, a lot of it has been about trying to get guys to consider and pay attention to what even a physical practice can do for you. And a lot of guys are like, hey, it's helped me with my back. It's helped me with stress. It's helped me hit the 4-iron another 25 yards. And that's great. I think if it works for you in any way, that's fantastic. There's also some great rewards that come out of having a dedicated yoga practice that are perhaps not fully understood and fully considered or fully expected. And so when you think about yoga, and I'm curious how you guys would define yoga, but when you think about yoga, it's more than what people probably think it is. And Johnny, it reminds me of a quote that you gave a while back was, what gets in the way of a lot of guys doing yoga is the word yoga. And the problem is it's their idea of what it is instead of truly what it is. So Johnny, why don't you start us off there? What is yoga?
You know what? I'd like to hear what Neil has to say, because I'm going to pivot off of what Neil has to say. And the reason why I'm going to kind of ricochet that to Neil initially is because I think I can answer that question pretty clearly. And I don't really know what yoga is. I'm not really sure. After next month, it'll be 23 years of dedicated practice. What do you think, Neil?
Well, I think that I aspire to get to the point where I don't know. But for now, I'll give some sort of an answer. First of all, Derek, I'm so glad that you're asking this question because it just doesn't get asked very often. You know, when I first started working with my yoga teacher, Tom Alden, he asked me what my personal definition of yoga was. And I started to just rattle off Patanjali's definition from the Yoga Sutras. And he kind of cut in and he was like, no, what's your definition? Like, how do you understand what it is? And I was kind of stumped at the time. This was maybe 7 years ago. And so the way I've come to define it is that yoga is the practice and the experience of communing with one's essential nature, or as it's sometimes translated in the Yoga Sutras, one's true nature. And so that's very broad, right? But from something broad, we can narrow down how we want to kind of take it from there. So I would just ricochet it back to Johnny from there and see what you think.
I think you could kind of come up with, and I thought about this before getting on the call with you guys, it's the idea of maybe we could even just say for the listeners, the origin of yoga from what we know historically is as old as the beginnings of being able to farm. And yoga, the word yoga came from the word yoke, which was, what they put two cattle on to make sure that they could kind of farm the land. And so it's this idea, and I'm going to use the word idea, of two things being joined together to be able to become a more powerful force. And so it could be two things. It could be 18 things. And it's where the idea of balanced athlete came from. It's like balance, like when something's balanced. Like we all know when we're feeling balanced in our life, how we feel better and we just feel more positive and we feel more connected. And when we're feeling balanced, and we all know what it feels like to be unbalanced and to not feel good and to not, feel connected. And so I think looking at this word yoga, to me, it's the aim of life, and such a deep, diverse thing that most people just think is stretching. And it's all of the misconceptions that people can have, particularly men, that gets in the way of really diving into really what yoga could be for them.
How does the physical practice help an individual start finding this sense in them or start paying attention to this sense within them? Neil?
The word that comes to mind for me is the word alignment. We're aligning the body and gravity. And when you start to pay attention to the body and you start to feel all these different parts of the body coming together as one whole, and things start to line up and feel right, you move better and you feel more integrated. That kind of connects with what Johnny was just talking about, more than one thing coming together to become a more powerful force. And a lot of times our mind is distracted. And, Johnny, you're the one who first mentioned to me this idea of distraction means to pull apart. And so when something's being pulled apart, it's not being yoked. It's not being brought together. And I think the physical practice, we take our mind and we engage our mind with the body in order to bring these different parts of the body together to perform some sort of a function, whether it's a posture or a transition from posture to posture. And as we start to get the feeling of bringing things together in alignment and things working together for a posture, that can sort of set the stage for how do we bring together the various components of our life to serve something that's a little bit bigger. whether that's our own personal purpose or our role in the world.
I mean, that's pretty beautiful, Neil, because now you're kind of bringing this idea of yoga like way beyond just a physical practice.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense to start with the physical body because it's so tangible. It's so easily experienced. I think most of us, meaning human beings, we spend so much time in our head in the theoretical, like, what am I doing? How am I going to get from point A to point B? That yoga physically can help us kind of step out of that and reconnect with the wisdom of the body. And sometimes stepping back is how we discover a little more space. And through space, we can change our perspective. So, yeah, I think starting with the physical actually makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Johnny, you've been practicing for longer than I have and teaching longer than I have. Have you found that when you start people who might be just showing up for physical reasons, that over time it sort of blossoms into something else for them?
I think generalizations are really helpful sometimes. And then sometimes I think they're incredibly limiting. But I think a generalization, yeah, I think the longer you kind of can stay around and keep practicing, I think you can start going way beyond physical. I think that's a big generalization. I said this to Riley Cote, and I'm only mentioning his name because Derek has interviewed him before on the show. And Riley likes to tell people that that was one of the first things that he really shifted him when he had met me. Was I just said, look, Riley, I've been doing this long enough. People aren't really coming to meet God. Most people are just coming because their knee or their back is messed up. And then if they stick around long enough, it's going to go way deeper than their knee or their back. Every once in a while, you get somebody coming in, they're just looking for the full-blown Godhead experience. But most people I find most people, men or women, they don't even really know what the hell they're looking for. And this has become an ongoing joke in our business. They just don't want to feel the way they feel. And it's kind of quite comical when people walk in or they call because they're not really sure what they're looking for. They just don't really they don't feel good.
Yeah. And when you say they don't want to feel the way they're feeling anymore, it's not just about the nag they feel in their lower back. I mean, it might be, but some of it I got to imagine is a bit of an existential kind of dread and looking for some other way to kick up the soil a little bit in their life and just explore something. Do you guys see that not only in your yoga classes, but your other interactions around this stuff?
I do. And I think what Johnny said is spot on. And it kind of connects back to the Buddha Dharma. And we started this conversation talking about our mutual teacher, David, but the first noble truth, the truth of suffering. And suffering can sound like a strong word. It might just be struggling. But yeah, it's like something's not going well and got to make a change, got to try something different and see if this can address it. And oftentimes I think they don't know what they're looking for, like Johnny said. But that's actually a really good thing because if you come in with an agenda like I want exactly this, you might actually be narrowing your mind to the point where you're not open to what else is possible. And so the mind of I don't know, like in Zen Buddhism, they're really into I don't know. My yoga teacher, whenever I say I don't know, he'll walk across the room and give me a high five. So I think there's an openness that comes with I don't know what I'm looking for, but I'm looking.
Johnny, anything else to add on that?
No, just double high five for Neil.
My intention on trying to cultivate these kinds of conversations with this podcast. What is it about yoga that I'm trying to bring and who am I bringing it to? And it's really about a lot of guys, ideally at midlife, who need to be able to yoke a little bit of what's going on. This podcast is really for guys who have bad backs, boring commutes, and busted careers. And that's not just the only sort of forms of existential dread or suffering or stress, but, I think it really can help redirect guys who are in some of those places. And so the original thought on getting us pulled together was trying to think about, the yoga of work. I think so much of our lives is spent in our vocation, 9 to 5, and for many people, more than 9 to 5. And some people probably feel stuck or feel challenged in their line of work. Perhaps it is a bad commute. Perhaps it's the lack of having any kind of commute and being stuck in your home 24/7, working remote. So, in helping guys make the connection between yoga, however they define it, that idea of finding wisdom in the body, space in the body, space within your soul and yourself, what's the opportunity with thinking about yoga or doing yoga for your vocation, your work life?
Oh man, that's a deep one, Derek. What is the vocation of it? Well, to me, I'm going to take a step back for a moment. I would just like to say that the way that I look at the practice of yoga encompasses every single aspect of one's life. And I'm going to talk to guys here right for a moment. It's really working on becoming the most skillful, badass motherfucker you can be. Period. So if you're interested in being a skillful, badass motherfucker, then you want to get into the practice of yoga. And what I mean by that is really looking the perspective of your life as something that is largely in your hand and being able to take control of it. That means from a mental perspective, an emotional perspective, a physical perspective, spiritual perspective. It's the whole kit and caboodle. Now, that's pretty overwhelming. If anybody was to hear that, they'd be like, whoa, dude, like that's pretty intense. Yeah, that's what I want. Like, where do I get started? Like, how do I start? And I think this is where it can become kind of somewhat challenging. Where do I start? I don't know, Neil. Like, if you looked at yoga as like, wow, like if you were listening to this interview, and where would you start? I mean, I know where I started, Neil. I know where you started. Derek, I know where you started. I started in a very broken, ignorant perspective. And not that I'm not broken, not that I'm not still ignorant, but, I started there.
I think the only place you can start is to start where you are.
Right.
And, the word that kind of came to mind is posture, because I've been thinking about something my teacher said in an email exchange I was having with him. And he said, the asana, the posture, is not just the pose. And I'll never forget this. He said, it is the way in, it is the dynamics within the pose, it is the fruition, and it is the way out. And it really struck me because you can apply that to anything. How am I entering this situation, the way in? What's my attitude going into this? And so starting where you are is literally where you are right now. And there might be a need to get on the mat and start doing the physical practice. But I think if we can notice our attitude going into every situation, noticing the way we're holding our bodies as we go into every situation, notice the way we're holding ourselves and steering ourselves dynamically within the situations, whether it's an asana or a difficult conversation or a job interview. And then noticing the fruition, what's coming out of the way I'm holding myself physically, what's coming out of the way I'm holding my attitude in this situation, and then finding where that leads us next. So I really like that Johnny asked that question of, where would you start? In the Buddhist tradition, our teacher David talks about ground, path, and fruition. And so I think just noticing, okay, well, like, where am I at right now? Just an honest self-reflection is probably ground zero, so to speak. What do you think, Johnny?
I think that's spot on. And I think the best place to start is just go start kind of checking out yoga studios, go take classes, get out, get in there, start putting yourself in these situations where you can start understanding what this physical practice of yoga winds up presenting, and then going from there, just kind of starting with that. Also under the assumption that, my first class sucked, dude. I didn't like anything about it. But I knew what I was doing was not working. My body was in pain, so lifting more weights wasn't going to work. Running more wasn't going to work. Playing more hockey wasn't going to work, which I do all of those things now. I just do them differently. But just being able to, no matter where you are in the world, you can find a yoga class.
So, Johnny, let me just go back to that for a second. On the physical stuff, you have a deep background in exercise science. I mean, you have just It's a huge library of experience working through many different modalities for building strength and stamina and balance. When you see someone who gets into a yoga practice, how do you see how that type of, gym stuff starts to integrate with somebody who has a yoga practice? Like, what are some of the things you see in an individual who has a yoga practice and how they bring that intentionality into some of what we think as a typical workout or training experience?
If I can only use one word, it's called skillfulness. Just skillful. You start to understand, what I learned practicing yoga was that just from a purely physical perspective, that the whole body is just interconnected. So when most people, men or women, lift weights or exercise, they do not have that perspective. They do not have that perspective that their foot is controlling the way their knee is tracking, and their knee tracking is being controlled by their hip, and the way they're holding their spine and the way they're breathing is either making their body work cohesively or it's working as pieces. So when you start practicing yoga, depending on the teacher and the discipline and all of that stuff, because I can't take responsibility for everybody, but if you've got a really skillful teacher, they're teaching you how the body is designed to work in concert, then you can't help but start carrying that awareness into the gym. And it's way beyond physical, as Neil was alluding to. It's mental, it's emotional. So the physical practice of yoga starts to get you to to train in that.
Yeah. And Neil, let me throw it to you because you also have a bodywork practice. Can you speak to a little bit of how not only what you know through your own experience, but what you've also sort of witnessed in the way some of your clients have improved their integration of body work with their own body and their own challenges when they do have some form of a yoga practice?
Yeah, I mean, the difference is significant. I've mentioned my teacher, Tom, a couple times, but he's a very, very skilled body worker. And he's used this phrase before, body janitor. Some people come in and they just want a body janitor. And then there's people who want to learn how to use their body the other 29 days of the month when they're not seeing you. And when there's someone who's actually kind of, as Johnny pointed out earlier, the ball's in your court. When someone is actually taking a sense of agency over, like, I'm going to learn how to use this physical body that I have. I'm going to get more skillful with it. And I'm going to get a little bit more aware of it and how it moves and where it feels like it's not moving well. That's a huge game changer, because when they come into me looking for manual therapy, they've already got a much clearer picture of what's going on. They're much better at just relaxing their arm when I'm holding it, instead of trying to hold it for me. And so I think awareness is really the most important thing someone can cultivate.
Years ago, I was recommended to go check out a great bodywork guy up in Boulder, a guy named Clint Chandler. Just an awesome guy. And when Clint met me, he was sort of like, well, let's just see if we can work together. Clint's, by the way, he's like just a huge dude who played good sort of maybe D3 college football. And he's like, before we sign for more classes, I just want to see if I can work with you. And what he was really saying was, is my body going to have the capacity to let go and to yield a little bit to some of the work that he was doing? But this stuff all takes work and it takes time to cultivate. And I just think the big word that I think of, learning how to yield. And that's why I say to guys, like, just roll out your mat in the morning, just lie on it. Like, even if it's 5 minutes before you go, while the shower's warming up or while you're listening to the news radio, try to focus on the yielding in your body. Learn to be able to just yield into the ground and learn how to let go and start there. And I just feel like that's not something that everyone thinks about when somebody suggests yoga, but it really is all yoga.
If I can bring it back to the noble truths, the first noble truth, suffering. Second noble truth is that the cause of suffering oftentimes is this clinging, this grasping, this kind of resistance to the flow of experience. I think it's also important to say, like, okay, well, let go and then what? Like, why am I letting go? Because oftentimes it's all our holding on so tightly that's actually getting in the way of the flow of something else. You know, like when your muscles are constantly tightening down, they're actually kind of tightening up on your blood vessels. So it's reducing the flow of circulation in terms of how smoothly it could flow. And I think that can be sort of a good metaphor for like when we learn to soften our grip in life, what are we making room for to flow more naturally, more fluidly?
Johnny, what goes into that space?
Potential. What's possible? You know, most people don't really think about letting go, but really, if you don't learn how to let go, at some point in life, we're all going to have to let go and die. So the more you can let go as you're moving throughout your life, then the easier it's going to be as you're getting into older age. So letting go is very simple, profound, very advanced, very necessary. I don't know what is a more necessary practice in life.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, I know that the initial feeling of letting go is a great sense of vulnerability. And it's obviously very hard to learn to somatically let that go. When I truly started to let go of my psoas on my right side, there was an absolute unfolding over time. And it was vulnerable because whatever was stabilizing my hip, it was the trauma of whatever I was dealing with deep in the pelvis, deep in the lower back. And once I started to really learn to let that go, I realized how vulnerable I was in stabilizing the entire leg. And I think what comes into that vulnerability, this wisdom and awareness. And so now that these muscles have opened up, you might not feel like you're ready to just punt that soccer ball all the way downfield or do something dramatic with that sort of awakening leg or hip. But you've got all this wisdom and be able to really learn how to contract and use those muscles. And so I think you kind of have to go through that threshold from vulnerability and a little bit of fear into that place of wisdom. And that probably could be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
What's coming to me right now is, you know, once you're able to kind of let go, this is a daily moment to moment practice in life. You know, if you're letting go of something, then you're opening up your hand to catch something. You can't catch something if you're holding something. So it's like you learn to let go and it's like, okay, now what am I opening my hand up to catch? And I don't know. You know, guys that are listening right now, it's like there's so many things that a human being, particularly a male, can tend to hold on to. And when you learn to let go of something, then it's like, all right, now what am I supposed to catch? What is out there for me to catch? And like all things, as you get more skillful at letting go, then you start being able to catch multiple things.
And if I could just add, you know, I think sometimes the fear that prevents us from letting go is like, what's going to catch me when I let go? And I think that there's a lot of different words you could use for that, for the answer to that question. I love that image, Johnny, of a closed fist can't catch anything. And it's that openness and that I don't know-ness that you kind of started with, which is actually so powerful. I think we feel like we have to know everything that's going to come next.
Isn't that so true, Neil? You're like, well, what do I need to expect? You know, it's like, I don't know.
That's beautiful.
Well, guys, I think this is an awesome spot to land. And it's just really great to get both you guys back on this podcast, but also just seeing you guys share your great wisdom and experience and thoughts. Thank you guys for coming back and sharing your time with us.
Thank you, Derek. And thank you, Johnny.
Yeah. Thank you guys both. Really appreciate it. So nice to share.
Awesome.
Let's do it again next week.
let's keep it going. Now, if you enjoyed this conversation and want to check out more, go back to my conversation with Neil in January of 22. It's titled, You're Not as Stuck as You Think You Are, where he shares some more empowering perspective on both Buddhism and yoga. And for more of Johnny's straight talk approach to Zen and mindfulness, check out Awareness, Healing, and Figuring Life Out through the Whole Body Experience back in November of 21. And remember to hook us up with some reviews and stars wherever you listen to this podcast. That stuff really helps. And for more quotes and nuggets, follow us on Instagram at GTY Podcast. Thanks again, and talk to you next time.